Thank you for listening to Failed State Update, the podcast. This is your host, Joseph L. Flatley. Before we get started, I wanted to let you all know that there is a Failed State Update newsletter now. Get the news of the weird sent directly to your email inbox. It's free to the people. Although, at some point I'm definitely going to add a paid tier so I can start raking in those big internet bucks. But that's in the future. And here in the present, I want all of you to subscribe to my email newsletter. You can find it on the web at lennyflatley.substack.com. That's lennyflatley.substack.com. We're going to begin with Anne Orchier, who is an organizer with NOlympics LA. That's a campaign to do exactly what it sounds like, kick the Olympics out of Los Angeles. Because although it seems like a wonderful, life-affirming, benevolent organization, the truth is the way the IOC operates and the way it affects these cities that it moves into every 4 years is problematic, to say the least.
My name's Anne, and I am an organizer with NOlympics LA, which is a coalition of, I think, around 30 groups now, mostly based in Los Angeles, but also extending through the state. And then we're also part of a larger transnational network of groups fighting to stop the Olympics from coming into our cities and destroying them. And exacerbating all of the issues that we're currently fighting, which are, we see as global issues, particularly around displacement, police militarization, environmental destruction, and erosion of democracy.
I think people's minds are going to be pretty blown when they find out you're anti-Olympics.
For sure. I think, one of the things that we typically point out or that I think is important to understand, and this also gets to the heart of one of the most common questions people ask us, which is, well, how can we fix this or change it? And the unfortunate answer is we can't. And a lot of that is because of how the Olympics are structured. The Olympics are run by a group called the International Olympic Committee, or IOC. They are based in Lausanne, Switzerland, which is folks who are familiar with 20th century history may know as a tax haven and place where basically, it's a little bit of a neutral zone for a variety of activities that basically to evade a lot of international law. And that's also where FIFA is based. And about 10% of the IOC, there's a representative from, each country. Most of them or not most of them, but a significant percentage of them are royalty. So it's not, it's not like a lottery or like average citizen. I was doing an interview with someone the other day who was talking about, the IOC's attempts at reform, and I was asking if, I was like, do you think that there would ever be or could ever be like a renter on the IOC, someone who doesn't not just because right now the people on the IOC, it's not just homeowners versus renters. It's like sheiks and the Crown Prince of Denmark on the IOC. And, Henry Kissinger is a member of the IOC. It's a lot of very powerful, evil people, essentially, is who's running the show, and there's no accountability. Host cities sign a contract with the IOC that essentially puts us on the hook for everything. And that's not to say that the leaders of our cities who go into these contracts, who sign these contracts, are getting duped by the IOC. They're going into it because they stand to make a lot of money and gain even more power. So essentially, the Olympics function as a vehicle for the already most wealthy and powerful people in the world to take more wealth and power and to dispossess and disenfranchise folks who are already struggling. So it's a land grab.
Could you go into that a little bit? Help me understand how that works practically.
Yeah. So looking at what's happened in past cities, it's the Olympics, because they set a sort of an event and timeline for when this mega event is going to happen. They allow the ruling class within a city. So in the case of Los Angeles, and which is the case for most global cities, are real estate developers, politicians, and anyone in control, or with a controlling like financial interest. It gives them this sort of timeline to remake cities and to cleanse cities. There's a really interesting provision in most host city contracts called the Clean City provision, which is nominally about protecting corporate sponsors. It's about allowing corporate sponsors like monopoly over sales and advertisements in the city, so that you couldn't, like, for example, if Pepsi is the official sponsor of soda of the Olympics, like Coke can't advertise. And it also allows the IOC to maintain a really intense stronghold over Olympic branding. So anything that, they basically control what gets sold. But in practice, cities also extend it to anything, when they say clean city, it means anything that could impede corporate sponsors' ability to sell their goods, which in practice means visible poverty, particularly homelessness, and then also political dissent. So those are the types of cities that we're talking about. We're talking about creating cities that are clean canvases for real estate speculators, for wealthy tourists, that push out people who are quote unquote, undesirable, who are sort of a blight on that image. And then the other sort of aspect of this too is, if you think about the, like the state of exception, right? Like looking at something like, the Patriot Act, or the kind of like shock doctrine, Naomi Klein, Giorgio Agamben school of politics, which, I personally adhere to, where in the event of a crisis, right, that's an opportunity for the ruling class to reshape and normalize what is the new normal. I think that's something we're all sort of looking at, or I should say, folks on the left and folks who are organizing, particularly around policing and surveillance, are talking about and thinking about now in terms of the pandemic. Anytime there's an event like this, that is an opportunity to sort of redefine what is normal in terms of state violence and control. And the Olympics present a similar opportunity as well. It's sort of, it's a state of exception, but around celebration instead of crisis. This idea of, we're preparing for this huge party and this huge event. And because of that, folks in, the folks who are nominally in charge of our city can kind of skirt around all of these things that normally people might raise their eyebrows at. There's the like social normalization level, and then there's also like an actual, it creates a lot of legal loopholes. So like two big examples, I would say in California, we have this, admittedly like very goofy, imperfect statewide law called CEQA, which is like the law that governs environmental reviews for new developments and new structures and buildings. There's an exemption in CEQA for anything related to the Olympics. So that's, and we've seen, like, from talking to other folks in Seoul, basically what developers in Korea did is around the Olympics, they were able to say, like, because we have this timeline that we need to meet, we can't afford to go through the normal environmental reviews and processes. And that sort of got passed through. But of course, that doesn't go away after the Olympics. Now that's just the standard. And similarly, with surveillance in Tokyo, we were there last summer, and something that we were seeing and hearing from folks is they started rolling out all of these new surveillance metrics and kind of tagging them to the Olympics. And that's just practice to see what folks will accept, things that people might normally kind of rankle at, like, oh, we're going to start scanning your eyeballs every time you come into the subway. People are a little freaked out, but if you tell them, like, oh, it's in preparation for the Olympics, like, we have to do it, it sort of shifts what the public perception is of that.
You basically just painted this stark picture in 5 minutes of the Olympics as this kind of capitalist monster that's going city to city and remaking it in its own image. And I think if people haven't thought about this before, it's going to be kind of some cognitive dissonance there. What year is the LA Olympics supposed to be?
2028 is when it's supposed to be. And we should note, too, that initially LA was bidding for 2024. So, there's a couple reasons to flag that. One is that, it's always funny, like when our mayor, Eric Garcetti, or the folks on the bid committee talk about the terminology is that a city wins the right to host, but technically LA didn't win. We came in second in a competition of 2. There were initially, I think, 5 or 6 cities bidding for 2024, and then all of them dropped out except for Los Angeles and Paris. And the IOC got desperate and basically said, okay, one of you can have 2024 and the other one can have 2028. And there was this like insane mad dash to kind of get the, to like get the ink on the paper and let the ink dry. It was literally like an 8-day turnaround, which is nuts. And they just crossed out 24 and wrote 28 on the contract. And it's just a reminder that it's like they're making up the rules as they go along. So this idea of it's set, thinking about, especially right now, the idea of planning anything that far in advance and making a deal for anything that far in advance. It's like, I wouldn't make a deal for anything 6 months from now, let alone 8 years from now. Like, who the hell knows what's going to be happening? But yeah, so 2028 is when they're theoretically supposed to be held, if the Olympics still even exist in 2028, and hopefully even if they do, we can all, kick them out of the cities where they're supposed to be held. But something we started seeing immediately, like basically as soon as the ink dried on the bullshit contract that the mayor signed, the big thing was hotel displacement, essentially, is that the city council members and the hotel developers, I should mention too, like half of our city council is under FBI investigation right now for bribery and, basically like accepting money from real estate developers in exchange for certain favors and like tax breaks on projects. And even if the deals that they had made were technically legal, they're just like so insane and immoral. They've been giving away billions of dollars in tax breaks and incentives to hotel developers at a moment where we have this, record like homelessness crisis, and our schools are being systematically defunded even before the pandemic. And then they just released the, proposed new budget this month, and surprise, like everything got defunded except for the police, which got expanded. But anyway, so our city council in the pocket of real estate developers and hotel developers in particular. And as soon as the Olympic bid got announced, they started pushing for hotel development in the name of the Olympics, basically saying, we're going to have a hotel shortage crisis in 10 years if we don't build more hotels. Which is not to mention, they've built hotel construction, and the number of hotel rooms has basically doubled in the last 10 years, so it's insane to suggest that that's the last thing that Los Angeles needs to begin with. But they sort of started planting this narrative, or they were attempting to plant this narrative, that we're going to run out of hotel rooms for the Olympics. And there's a state law in California called the Ellis Act, which it has a few elements to it, and I won't get into all of them, but the important one to note here is there's a provision. Part of what it does is it allows landlords to evict people in rent stabilized housing, which is the only form of housing in LA that poor people can afford, essentially. And it allows landlords and building owners to evict evict tenants if they are converting it into a hotel. So that's already been a problem. And then with the Olympics coming up, we started seeing honestly, it came up even faster than I was expecting. I sort of expected there to be like a beat before they started doing it, but it was like sign the contract. And then like a month later, they were putting forward motions saying, okay, we need to demolish these 8 buildings in order to build this massive hotel complex, we need to evict, there's one main one, like the first one in particular that I'm thinking of in South Central LA, where they evicted 32 families.
And you said that LA and Paris got picked for the next two because a bunch of cities dropped out. Mm-hmm. Could you explain how that would happen, or why a city would drop out?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, in the last few decades, like, there have been pretty active and visible Olympic opposition movements in every city that has, that has bid, with the exception of cities with very intense, autocratic, regimes, where, protesting can get you killed. And so, yeah, pretty much any city where you can protest and stay alive, there have been protests against the Olympics. And I mean, pretty simply, Paris and Los Angeles were the only cities that didn't vote.
And then what about the experience of these cities, past Olympics? What does the city look like after the Olympics is done and moves on?
Yeah, I think the important thing is whatever changes and things happen in the preparation stage, like those things stick. Mm-hmm. The best kind of example or anecdote I can think of, and this covers a number of different categories, but for example, London and the preparation for their games, they were already, the most surveilled city. Police militarization and surveillance ramped up so intensely in the lead up to the games. And we have Dave Zirin, who's an amazing sports journalist, who, we speak to and work with a lot, and who's one of the, I think one of the few journalists who actually covers the intersection of sports and politics actively and very well. He told us a story at one point about how he was talking to one of the people, working on security for the London Games, who was describing some of these really intense and terrifying new technologies that they were using. And he asked that question, well, what happens after the Olympics are done? Once the ostensible, threat is over. What happens to all of this stuff? And the guy he was talking to just turned to him and was like, well, he's like, we're not putting it back in the box. And so just remembering, it's oh yeah, any changes, so for example, these hotels, this idea that, oh, we need to build these hotels for the Olympics. And it's well, embedded in that, it's not like they're going to tear the hotel down and move poor people back into the neighborhood once it's over. That neighborhood is permanently changed. That neighborhood is a destination for wealthy tourists now, and the poor families are gone. They're out of LA. They're not, at this point, LA is not affordable to the extent that if you get displaced from your home, you're gone. You're out of the city.
The Olympics kind of form a unique opportunity to see kind of the weird Orwellian thing that's happening in all cities all over the world, kind of concentrated. I remember Dave Zirin describing in Olympic Village in Rio, this was that the headquarters for the security was in a big plexiglass box raised above, it's he was describing something out of 1984, and it was a really stark image. And I just think it's important for people to start seeing these massively corporate funded ventures for what they really are.
Totally. I think, and you mentioned cognitive dissonance earlier. Actually, before I talk about that, I just want to note the Olympic Village is supposed to be in Westwood at UCLA, which parenthetically, Westwood is the most unaffordable rental market, in terms of neighborhoods in the entirety of California. I forget what the exact percentage is, but some insane percentage of UCLA students recently, in the last year was announced, are unhoused, cannot live in their cars, do not have housing. So the idea that they're going to take that neighborhood that is already so completely unaffordable to the extent that that Westwood is the neighborhood where UCLA is, right? That most of the people who are creating, who are part of the social fabric of Westwood cannot afford to live there, but they're going to displace even more people to host athletes is nuts. But then the entire plan, the Olympic plan, it covers pretty much the entirety of LA County, as well as parts of Ventura County and Orange County too. So the footprint of the Olympics, it's like kind of the entire, like a huge chunk of the Southern California region. It's not just the city of LA. So when like thinking about land grabs, this is a huge, huge footprint. But yeah, in terms of, getting back to like cognitive dissonance and what the Olympics reveal, I think one of the main things we're up against is this sense of like, at least on a cultural level, there's this sense of LA exceptionalism. And I think connected to our larger political moment too, like, this clinging to the idea of the, resistance Democrats are going to save us. Because LA, we have the vision of, I think, what a lot of other places are fighting for, this idea, right, of like, oh, if we can just get more progressive Democrats into office, things are going to be okay. And it's like, I get that psychologically, like it is hard. It's that I'm sure, there's some like name or Freudian stage for it or other psychological stage for it when you realize that your parents aren't superheroes. That's like a defined developmental stage. But yeah, recognizing it's like, oh yeah, our progressive Democratic mayor who identifies, he identifies as a Mexican, Jewish, Italian, diversity hire. His dad was the most powerful cop in LA for a long time. So his dad is, so Eric Garcetti is our mayor. His dad is Gil Garcetti, who is the DA who presided over the O.J. Simpson trial, and basically his career ended after that. But yeah, just recognizing it's like, Eric Garcetti loves he'll tweet, not even honestly, in my opinion, really good zingers at Donald Trump, these kind of like weak sauce zingers at Donald Trump. And people will be like, yeah, like he's our progressive champion. But then you look at the Olympic bid and it's like, well, with this bid, he's making a multi-billion deal with Donald Trump. Like he's sitting down. He's had more meetings with Donald Trump about the federal security plans for the Olympics than he has with immigrant rights leaders in Los Angeles. Donald Trump is the true partner of and that's their words, not mine, of the 2028 Olympic Games. Right before the pandemic hit, Trump was in Los Angeles giving press conferences with the chair of the 28 bid, which is, who's Eric Garcetti's like childhood friend and close colleague. In the Department of Homeland Security, talking about how they're going to use the 2028 Olympics to clean up Los Angeles in terms of illegal immigration and homelessness. So it's like, yeah, what are the actual relationships? What are the power dynamics at play? It sort of throws a lot of that into light too.
Yeah, and that's really where we are as a country right now. It's like you can do whatever you want as long as you're like lobbing a few tweets at the Trump administration now and then to like kind of remind people that you're on their side. They're not going to look at you they're not going to give you any like discriminating examination, and you're going to be able to get away with whatever you want.
Yeah. It reminds me, I have a friend who gave me, this was advice more on like an interpersonal and dating level, where she was like, put them on mute, right? Like just stop paying attention to what they're saying, like turn the volume off and like look at what they're doing.
Right.
And it was really helpful. And I feel like that's good advice politically too. It's like, yeah, don't look at what Eric Garcetti is tweeting. Look at what he's doing. And same like Nancy Pelosi, all that shit this week of like, oh, she called Trump fat. Like, yes, queen. And it's like, yeah, she called him fat, and then she signed in co-signed the biggest, like handed over trillions of dollars to his military. Like what? Okay. Like, and with Eric Garcetti, you can even tell too, it's like he'll write these mean tweets, and it's like, if you pay attention, Trump's not tweeting back at him because he knows that he's getting what he wants. Like he's not, like Eric Garcetti is handing over the LAPD and handing over the region through this Olympic bid.
how has things changed, or how do you see things changing with the Olympics in light of this COVID-19 pandemic?
So first of all, the Tokyo 2020 games were officially postponed. And the conversations are already starting now about, are those going to be canceled or postponed again? And I think, again, people are seeing it's more clear. The IOC and the National Organizing Committee and the local organizing committee are just making so many unforced errors and like not trying to hide what their true interests are in terms of who they're protecting and what they're protecting when they make decisions. They waited a really long time to announce the postponement. They were claiming basically up until the very last minute that they possibly could that they were fully planning to hold the Olympics in July, even when most of the world knew that that was impossible. So I think that started to, like, again, those schisms start to form where people are like, what the hell? Like, what's going on? Like, who are these people? It started to reveal what some of those power dynamics are. Like the fact that the IOC is fully running the show and they're the ones who make the decisions. And even if once that contract is signed, it's very hard for cities to renegotiate anything. And I think most people don't realize that. And this is putting the nature of those relationships fully on display. I think it's sort of, this is not a good feeling, but it has confirmed a lot of the hypotheticals that we had brought up a couple of years ago, that our mayor and the folks, the press corps in our city, when we would bring up these hypotheticals, they would their answer was just like, well, that's not going to happen. Like, we continually brought up, particularly in LA, like the prospect of huge natural disasters, like how there are no provisions in this contract for if anything happens in LA. Like, if we continue to have increasing massive wildfires, if there is a huge earthquake, like what happens to this contract? Basically, the way the contract is written, it suggests that the taxpayers of LA and California are just on the hook, that we just owe the IOC millions, potentially billions of dollars. And Garcetti and the LA Times, like, their answer was just sort of like, oh, you guys are being paranoid. Like, nothing like that is going to happen. We didn't specifically bring up a global pandemic, but for me, like, a global pandemic falls into that category of like unforeseen massive events that would, interfere with our ability to host the games, quote unquote. And so, yeah, what's happening right now, in particular what's happening with Tokyo, I think demonstrates to people like, yeah, there is no plan B. Like, this is, when you sign up to host the Olympics, that becomes the priority for the city, and everything else falls by the wayside. And it doesn't matter if, people start dying off en masse. It doesn't matter if there's a global pandemic, in Japan, they had the earthquake and nuclear disaster and Fukushima, like, that stuff doesn't matter. That the recovery of your health and community is going to be secondary to the profit of these folks. And I think people are seeing that play out in real time, and hopefully are getting, people's awareness and resistance to those narratives is building.
So that was my interview with Anne Orchier, an organizer with NOlympics LA, which is a campaign to stop the evil, destructive life force being that is the Olympics from swallowing up another American city. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Yasha Levine. It's like when I watch TV, and like when people started quarantining, they were talking about how weird it was to like watch TV and see people like shaking hands and hugging and going into crowded rooms and stuff. And that's not what struck me as odd. What strikes me as odd is when I'm watching something and somebody has like hopeful plans for the future. I'm just like, how could you even, think about more than like a week or two in advance in this state? Like, that's what strikes me as odd.
Yeah, no, a lot of people, especially people who are a bit, better off, and are just used to having things stable, and have had things stable and maybe even improving for the last 10 years, 20 years or whatever, with the last sort of economic collapse, we all sort of like had amnesia on that. 12 years ago, people thought the shit was just going to end. I remember that quite vividly. I thought so too. If I even moved to a suburb in the Mojave Desert to kind of get a sense of what life was like in this sort of collapsing post real estate bubble life, But people have, people here. I'm in LA now again. Just moved back here from New York a few months ago, right before the pandemic hit, and I'm in this neighborhood where it's sort of like a bit of a bougie neighborhood with a lot of media people who live here. Various sectors of the media world. From musicians to people, to actors, to whatever, to people who work on sets and things like that. And, and the people who are a bit more successful or a bit more stable, even just briefly talking to them, some of my neighbors, it's like you really get the sense that they think it's just going to be over in like 3 months, or like it's going to be over just as soon as they're going to lift restrictions pretty soon. And it's going to be great. And, you hear them clapping every day at 8 p.m., to solidarity with the, nurses and the doctors and the sort of the service personnel that is out there, and you get the sense it's like, yeah, you're clapping for them, but like, what are you doing for them? What are you like? It's like this clap signifies the idea that we're just got to hunker down a little bit for just a little bit more. We got to stick together, and then everything's going to be back to normal. And we don't really have to do anything or change anything or just thinking that the political status quo is all right. Maybe if you just change Trump or something, but like it's just this this virus has sort of exposed the fundamental like neoliberal sort of rot and vacancy at every level of our society, not just the federal government, but states, counties, cities. In LA here, the lack of response to the pandemic and to some of the social and economic issues like homelessness and like tenants' rights and things like that the pandemic exposed. They've done nothing about it, So I don't think things are going back to normal for a lot of people, just on the state in the shape of, the shape of what our government looks like, even and how much support it gives. It's going to be cut, but that's just sort of a small portion of what's going to be different. I don't know. Just about, like so much of our economy and people, I don't know, some musician friends of mine, and, they talk about, it's just like they're looking at, their music and touring and, things like that. The whole economy that underpinned it is over, pretty much, so there's so it's not going to go back to normal. So there's going to be some, the tech companies are going to benefit, all the monopolies are going to benefit. But like, I think it's going to rewire a lot of our lives. It seems like it,
What is, and this coronavirus thing is hitting Los Angeles on top of a already massive homelessness problem. Like, how is the homeless population being affected, or has there been any? I don't know. You posted one picture on your Substack, of like hand washing stations for homeless people, which is the most ridiculous thing.
Well, look, there's I think there's over 50,000 homeless people in just LA City, and in the county, it's a lot more than that. It has the biggest unhoused population in America. That's sort of living on the streets. It's incredible. I just came back to LA, just like I said, and we left in 2000 and shit. When did we leave? 2014, I guess. And it was already bad back then, and coming back now, it's incredible. Every little nook and cranny, every underpass, freeway underpass, sort of every sort of shoulder next to a freeway that is kind of like unused and kind of in an out of the way spot is filled with tents. With permanent encampments. People live there permanently. And and there's been like some like bond measures, some like tax measures that that collect money to build housing for homeless people, that sort of everyone in LA supported, but like nothing's been done because nobody wants to have this stuff built in their neighborhoods. The politics of the sort of the landowning class and the homeowning class here is extremely reactionary. They hate the homeless people. They want them to just disappear. Before the crisis even hit, the mayor's office was working with the Trump administration and talking to what's the doctor guy who was leading the housing development office. Ben Carson. He's the guy sort of
the brain surgeon.
The housing man for exactly brain surgeon, the brain surgeon housing guru of the Trump administration. He is in talks with the liberal resistance hero. Mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, about basically using federal land in LA County, like on the outskirts of LA County somewhere, to build encampments for the homeless. So that was the plan. The plan was to create fucking camps for them out of sight, like out of mind, and that was the I think they were really hoping for that before the corona hit. I mean, it was right leading up to this, and so. There's a couple of things that have been going on in LA County. There's like a program that they're trying to take over some empty hotels and pay them day rates and house homeless people there for the duration of the crisis. I think to date they've like housed 1/50th or less even, I think, of the population, maybe 1,000 people or something of the entire homeless population. Which numbers in the tens of thousands. I mean, the official statistics, 50,000 is probably much higher than that. So there's like these programs in there, they do these promotional videos that show these really, happy people who are taken off the streets and, put into a pretty nice hotel room. Really grateful, obviously, for this, but like it's just a tiny little thing. It's not systemic, and it's only for the duration of the pandemic. And so you just have people. So I live in this neighborhood, Los Feliz, sort of on the edge of Little Armenia, and like just down the street, north of Vermont Street, that runs, along my apartment. Like it's like in the morning you go down there, it's empty because no one's walking around. It's quarantine, and just, there's probably a dozen people just sleeping within like a block, sort of 2 blocks from me, And then if you go down further, there's a whole encampment. And they're kind of just left alone, I think, for the most part. Cops don't harass them as much. I mean, although they do, if they get complaints. And so the city is like distributed some hand washing stations. So if you're a homeless person, you can walk up to this thing and wash your hands. Some of them, I checked were working, but a lot of them don't work, or like because you have to constantly refill them with water. There's not a lot of water in there. To refill them with paper towels, with soap, all this stuff. They do that, I think, to some degree. But then on the other hand, they in these spots where there's been fights between the locals and local homeless community, like in Echo Park, where there's a park and there's been this group of homeless people that have been trying to like just live in this park in this sort of very well organized tent city. The local homeowners have been like warring with them and. So the city, even though legally it voted to keep all the public restrooms open, 24 hours a day through the pandemic, so to facilitate, hygiene, right? But they've been locking those doors because they want to use the virus, the pandemic as a pretext to make life as uncomfortable for these people as possible. Because so they've been deploying this kinds of stuff, in a targeted way, in a very malicious way, in their ongoing fights with some problematic homeless communities that are, decided to live in kind of nicer real estate areas, and not like hide themselves under overpasses and freeway on-ramps and things like that. And so it's really shitty. I mean, they haven't done anything really. I mean, they've housed 1/50th of the population for the time being. I doubt they're going to expand it very much. I mean, part of it is actually resistance from the locals. I mean, this cannot be overlooked. I mean, the neoliberal nature of the government goes hand in hand with the really reactionary politics of sort of the landowning class here, probably everywhere. Because these are the only people who really have political power and really exercise their political power, and so any kind of attempt to help the homeless or to open up a homeless shelter in a community or build housing for the homeless in the community, or even going so far as renting out a motel in a community and putting homeless people there for the duration of the epidemic meets resistance from the locals. And so that's not just in LA. I mean, it's in San Francisco. So all these liberal cities here on the West Coast, their real reactionary, kind of very fascistic side comes out very, very quickly. If you're asking a community to say, hey, open your, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to do a single thing. You just have to let this, homeless people live in this home, in this building that's being built for them.
Your book Surveillance Valley, that gave me a really useful frame for looking at this coronavirus thing, actually. And it's I realized it, I understood this, but your book put it in real kind of sharp focus for me. The idea that in the context of your book, these supposedly insurmountable privacy problems that the Silicon Valley has were being treated like technological problems by the companies that had a financial stake in your privacy, but really they were political problems.
I see what you mean. What you're saying is they approach it as a purely technical problem to solve, rather than it be this technical problem is intertwined with the politics that gave rise to it, and are sort of governing the way that this pandemic sort of evolves and how we deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. The economy is broken, so Trump wants everybody to go back to work, and it's well, make Jeff Bezos pay his taxes and give that money to people so they don't have to go to work, and ride it out. It's pretty simple.
Exactly. It's not going to happen. It's funny. These viruses, they're kind of cool if you approach them intellectually. Just these kind of pathogens are cool. You approach them from a political and a historical perspective. Because they're always it's almost like they're like tracer chemicals or something that are shot into a body. Sometimes when you go to a doctor, in order to trace the blood flow and to see inside your body, you're given these tracer chemicals, and then they're slightly radioactive, and so they can be sort of tracked, right? It's kind of like that, because it sort of shows the shape of a society and shows all the forces of it. And so when the virus itself is a product, most likely is a product of our hyper-industrial, hyper-globalized system, where everything is just, the natural environment is just mowed down completely, bulldozed, and in its place are built, factory farms, monocrops, to grow kind of this to support this industrial agriculture and this industrialized global system that we have. And so the very nature of the fact that this bat virus, somehow was able to jump from a bat to, I don't know, to some other potentially host, to maybe a pig or something, to us. Again, the details of this are still very murky, but it's pretty clear that a lot of these pandemics that have been occurring, most of the big sort of viral outbreaks can be traced back to basically imperialism and capitalism and sort of this hyper-industrial capitalism we live in. Basically, there's a destruction of natural habitats, the destroying of these sort of natural barriers and firewalls that isolate species and that have evolved over millennia, and bring these creatures back closer to us, or we come closer to them, and thus they enter into our society, into human civilization, whether it's through industrial like hog farming or whatever. These things are incubated and basically then enter the human world. And then as they flow through, they reveal all the weaknesses, and they reveal how kind of power works. And it makes society more transparent. And so you have a government that is, not just not ready, but even when, they have several months to get shit going and to get things going, they are actually structurally unable to do anything. So it's like it's incredible. It's incredible to watch. It's the total outsourcing of political power to private interests. So this virus to me is like I'm quite honest. I'm like, I've been reporting on the power of the oligarchy in America ever since I came back to the States and became a journalist here. Right around actually the real estate collapse 12 years ago, and so I'm even taken by surprise by the sheer emptiness of our government institutions on every level and how completely they've been hollowed out.
Yeah, and there was a point, I think it was like one of the first coronavirus task force meetings where Fauci was talking about like what they're going to have to do to get a hold on this virus, and he basically said, these are almost the exact words, like, the system isn't made to handle a crisis like this, so, we have to figure out how to incentivize private companies to come in and, help us sort this out. Like, he was literally saying, in America, unless somebody's making money off something, we can't have it happen. So we got to figure out who's going to, get rich off of this, it was mind-blowing to me. I just thought it was crazy.
And that's not even taken as a scandalous statement or as a shocking statement. It just, this is just sort of people just assume that's just how things work and how they should work. No, it's crazy. I mean, like, to the point where it's like it's just I don't know. It's just I'm sitting here, kind of overwhelmed by, we're all sitting in our like command and control centers, right? We're like with our able to see all the, information around the world, happening in real time, and it's being beamed into our brains. It's overwhelming. Like I said, this virus is like a tracer. It's like a tracer chemical or tracer agent that just, it's shot into our body politic, and like it kind of shows its systemic nature, how the systems operate. And obviously, you kind of knew, and I knew, and anyone who critically has looked at our society for last few decades has known that, like, how completely hollowed out is become, but it's been shocking to see this happen in real time.
Yeah, and nobody knows anything else, it seems, so it's not alarming. Like Cuomo the other day talking about how they're going to use this virus as an opportunity to recreate education in New York.
Yes.
Involve meaning.
With Microsoft,
exactly.
With Microsoft.
And I've been reading for years about like these Gates Foundation initiatives in Africa where they're like giving everybody computers, but it's all Microsoft computing, and like they're creating new Microsoft customers, and all the old systems that they've been using that have been working really well have to go, and all these problems with the Gates Foundation like bullying its way through the different nonprofit, aspects of the nonprofit sector, and now it's coming to New York, and it's coming to the United States, which is like third world America, essentially.
I mean, yeah. Look, the empire always comes home, right? I mean, it always comes home. I mean, it's always there's always the. It's almost like it's a cliche at this point, the blowback in all these various different manifestations. But things that that's why it's weird, that a big part of sort of the new left, especially like kind of the Bernie Sanders left, the new DSA left, and kind of the Jacobin left. I mean, I'm not to say they're not anti-imperialist. I think they are, but there is a big sort of downgrading of the sort of imperialist focus that has existed on the left for as long as it really existed. My sense of it, and because the empire and focus on the empire is really important, because the empire isn't just something that happens overseas. I mean, it's because the same forces that are in power domestically in our society are the ones who are doing this shit overseas, and eventually that comes home sooner than later, and it comes home sometimes in piecemeal. People don't think about it, and people don't realize it, but on some level, yeah, all this sort of. Again, there's so much to investigate, and there's not enough journalists to do this anymore, especially out here on the West Coast, where journalism is basically non-existent. I know that a couple of people have been sending me information about how San Francisco is now contracting with this, is trying to get this contact tracing initiative off the ground, and with this digital platform. And one of the company that they have contracted with is actually funded by USAID, and is normally done work in, again, like, in foreign countries and in sort of poorer countries, doing various kinds of strange, like, health, surveillance initiatives. And it's like one of these, almost like something that Pierre Omidyar would fund, with these kind of digital surveillance, digital counterinsurgency, digital kind of sort of imperial management platforms, And now that apparently that company is now being used, or they're developing a solution based on the platform of this company. So it's like you have USAID funded technology coming home. And again, this fits in with the general history of computer technology and the internet and all these things that are sort of based on that. It was initially funded as a military technology, right? I mean, really, it in a big way came out of the Vietnam War and the counterinsurgency efforts there. And so, and not just the internet specifically, but various technologies that are related to it. Like, for instance, one of the first sort of digital borders technologies that was developed for Vietnam to bug the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and to kind of provide these sensors that would alert for movement, troop movement, so that they can be bombed. And in fact, I was just actually talking on the phone to a guy who ran the bombing missions on that. They get the coordinates from a control center, an IBM control center that was in Thailand. They get the coordinates, and those coordinates would be based on sensors that would sometimes placed by hand on the Ho Chi Minh Trail by soldiers had to infiltrate through the jungle and place them. Sometimes they'd be dropped from the air, and they'd be kind of embedded into the ground. And then they get the coordinates from the control center, and they bomb that place based on where they think there's movement. But almost immediately, so like in the early 70s already, that technology came and was used. I think it was on the Arizona border, embedded, to monitor illegal border crossings. And so that stuff. So that stuff always comes home. And sometimes it comes home immediately, like within the span of a couple of years. And the same thing with the internet. The internet was developed to as wasn't supposed to be deployed against domestically, for disturbances in America. It was supposed to be as the operating system of a command and control system for the military. But immediately was used to process surveillance data on American civil rights activists and American anti-war protesters. So the technology stuff always comes home, but also just the mentality and the ideology also comes home, which is what we're seeing with in all these different ways with the virus. Also someone who's from the Soviet Union, and someone who knows what America did to Russia in the 90s, what America helped do in Russia, which is to completely hollow out the state and transfer all power to into private hands, into this oligarchy. You can almost see it like as it was done very quickly in the span of just a number of years, but you can almost see that what happened in Russia in the 90s with America's help and prodding and support, America did to its own society, but on a slightly slower time scale. On some level, it's like a dress rehearsal or something, or it's like a trial run. The hollowing out of the society is spectacular for me to see.